And think about what it does for your sales process, because people are already pre-sold. They know you. They know who you are. They know what you do. Yep. And it makes getting them on the phone or whatever your sales process is so much easier, because you don't have to win them over. You don't have to convince them of anything. They're already convinced. And I think for anybody who is in sales, that's a great reason to have a podcast.
I'm Ken Newhouse. To me, building a profitable business isn't only about generating leads and driving sales. It's about who we are and what we're made of. I succeed in business by finding the most effective client attraction methods and find the most effective client attraction methods to succeed in business. Join us on the quest as we search for the newest and most effective methods you can use to get clients now. Hey everybody, Ken Newhouse here, and I want to welcome you to this episode of the Get Clients Now podcast. And with me today, got a special guest. In fact, they're all special, but he's special because number one, he's a professional podcaster. Number two, he's written a killer book, and I love to consume books. You guys know I'm an avid reader, but he wrote a killer book called The Big Podcast. So I want to welcome Mr. David Hooper on the show. Do you go by Hoop at all? I mean, it sounds like you should be like in a cop show, like from the 80s or something.
You know, the Hooper that people know of, Burt Reynolds had a movie called Hooper.
Yeah.
And Hooper was a big character in Jaws. But yeah, people do call me Hoop sometimes. That's just natural fit, I guess.
Hooper and Captain Quint, wasn't it?
You know, I don't remember, but everybody's like Jaws when I say my name, especially back in the day. You know, now if Jaws ever comes up for a rework, I'll be famous once again.
They'll have to come up with a better shark. But anyway, hey, listen, if you could, I think most people who are listening to my show are familiar with you. I mean, how could they not be? I think most people who listen to any kind of podcast would all know who you are, David. But if you could, just take a minute or two, bring us up to speed on like who you are, how you got to the point of writing your book. Give us your backstory. This is not your typical episode of the Get Clients Now podcast. Instead, it's more of a collection of discoveries and observations I discuss with legendary podcaster and best-selling author David Hooper about podcasting, a passion that brings me endless amounts of joy and suffering.
Well, the quick backstory is I grew up in Nashville. I'm in Nashville right now. And one of the things we do here is music. We're known as Music City, USA. So I started off in the music industry, and that is what got me into radio. And I did that to actually promote myself as a musician. Found out that that was not legal, called playola or plugola. And you're not able to do that. So I started using it as a medium, either for hosting or when I got into music marketing later after school. I was a music marketer, and we would use radio to play records of other people, not mine. But that always kept me in touch with it. And then I got on the radio myself, and podcasting was one of those things that grew from radio. So here I am as a podcaster.
So wait a minute. You're telling me it's not legal for you if you're the radio host to play your own music and promote yourself?
You cannot do that. And that's actually a funny backstory, because that used to happen all the time in the 50s. You might know the name Alan Freed. You certainly know Dick Clark.
Yeah.
But a lot of these old school DJs, they were basically on the payroll. And I've got funny stories of old school DJs that I've talked to, and they would have two stacks of records, the one that had cash in them and the one that didn't. And sometimes what they would do is they would actually take credit, meaning they would say they were a writer when they were not. A lot of original Chuck Berry music had a co-writer on it, even though it didn't have a co-writer. They just wanted to get paid.
Right.
And that was made illegal. So you can't plug your own stuff on the radio, because radio is considered a public service. That's why the FCC is involved, and it should be for the community. It isn't always these days, but one of the things that keep people from getting radio, and that's actually how it differs from podcasting. Podcasting, we can plug away.
So now you've opened up like a rabbit hole for me to run down, and that is...
Go for it.
Because I used to have my own radio show, but my radio show was a paid spot. And that's when I was a chiropractor in practice. And I had a radio show every Saturday morning in Rolla, Missouri for an hour. So I could plug my own self. But when you're running a radio show, you have paid sponsors that run commercials.
Well, there's that. And I think you probably were paying to be on the radio, and they considered it advertising.
Yes.
And there would be a notice at the very beginning of it, I'm betting. So you're about ready to hear a paid advertisement, paid by blah, blah, blah. And
They probably did. A disclaimer. I don't remember that, but I'm sure they did just because that's like the law. I'm sure they did.
Yeah, 100% right. And you can actually do that. You can actually pay to play music as long as you say that it is an advertisement. Of course, sometimes people get that and sometimes people don't. But what they don't want with radio is they don't want you playing music that you're involved with, that you don't talk about that connection.
Okay.
And that's really, there's ways around it.
Okay.
But for you to get up there and be the DJ and hosting this stuff where you've got a public airwave, and back in the day, radio was powerful. So they were more or less on the take from every which way and weren't announcing that. And it was using, we'll call it, I guess, a government resource. I don't know who owns the air, but the government thinks they do. So it wasn't exactly on the up and up. And it was actually changing what we heard on the air. It wasn't an impartial vehicle like it could have been.
Right. So you got into podcasting, if I understand this correctly, is kind of a backdoor way to promote your music and be a music marketer?
Well, that's how I got into radio.
Okay.
So the podcast and the radio, the most recent stint at radio actually came up at the same time. I was in a radio business office at the 31st floor of the LNC Tower in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. And I was pitching these guys on doing a radio talk show. We were going to syndicate it. I had big ideas for it. And even though it was in Nashville, they weren't really sure if it was going to work for the community.
While on a lot of my shows, I unapologetically interview real, often unknown folks who are getting it done in the trenches. I'll admit that I have an intense desire to get that one amazing interview that on one hand, everybody wants, but realistically, no one's been able to get. The interview that you'd love to talk about with anyone who, upon learning of it, would say, "Wow, dude, every podcaster on the planet would give their right arm to interview that guy or that gal. I don't know how you pulled it off. That's huge."
Again, when you're doing something, whether it's a podcast or certainly radio, part of the deal is you want to have an audience and will people listen to this? And it was a music radio talk show. And I happen to know a guy named Dave Jackson. You may be familiar with him, School of Podcasting. He was also in music at that time, and he had just started a podcast a month or two earlier. And I mentioned it. I said, if you're interested in expanding beyond Nashville and beyond where your tower and your signal goes, there's this thing called a podcast. We could put it up online and we could have a national audience. So I got into podcasting that way. They were like, okay. And they were interested. And that's what got me on the radio. And that's what got me into podcasting, because they wanted to expand the audience. And it was a fluke at a time. Nobody thought it was really going to be what it is today.
Dave was a guest on my show probably 2 years ago. So yeah. He's been on my show.
Yeah, and that was just a complete fluke that Dave was a musician and he had a musician newsletter, and then he got into podcasting. He was one of the first guys there. And therefore, because I knew him, I was one of his first listeners. And I was like, well, if this guy's doing this thing online and I've got a radio show, why don't we just stick it up online? And it was really more of a radio show that we stuck up online more than a podcast. But, we called it a podcast. It was in podcast directories, eventually iTunes, and now called Apple Podcasts.
Hey, listen, let me ask you this. What's something about you, and we're going to dive into your book here in just a minute, but what's something about you, David, that the marketplace, your fan base, really, and you do have a huge fan base, by the way, and we're going to get into that as well, but what's something about you that the marketplace, your fan base really doesn't know about you, but you'd like them to know?
That's such a great question. And if I can talk about the topic just in general, I think it's an interesting one. I think as podcasters or public figures, you've got that public life, the thing that you want everybody to know, but you do have those things that it's maybe not that important. But I think when people find out about it, it can make people feel more connected to you. And there are a lot of those things that I never mention because it just has nothing to do with podcasting. And I'll give you an example. I plant a lot of trees in the neighborhood.
Nice.
I live in an urban neighborhood in sort of downtown Nashville, right on the outskirts of downtown. And we just had a tornado come through here, and we've had a few of them.
Yeah, I drove through
20 years.
Right after it came through, yeah.
You've seen it. I remember talking about that.
Yeah.
Took out a lot of trees, and I believe in, environmentally. I think it's a nicer thing to look at rather than just concrete. Keeps things quieter. It provides shade and protection and oxygen. So yeah, I do a lot of stuff like that just on the side. So Thanks for the opportunity to say, plant a tree, everybody. Take it to podcasting. Think about that. Like the world that you're living, if you want to have those great ideas, whether you're in sales or podcasting or doing whatever you do, sometimes you have to switch your environment. And that's a great way to do it. We as people, again, podcasting, any kind of public persona that you've got, we should be able to change those things. I was eating meatball Subway sandwiches. I never thought that I would do this, especially growing up in the 70s and the 80s. Like, oh, those guys are weird. Never thought. Then you become one of them. But do it on your level, right? You don't have to necessarily go 100%. And people are complex. And I think that's one of the great things about podcasting. You're not going to hear that on the radio. You're not going to hear the nuance that we have. And that's the opportunity. And that's why I think it can be good for your business to take it to what you're talking about. Get clients now. People get to know you or feel like they know you. And it could be those little things that you drop in.
Why do we fall in love with the idea of a big something or another? A big guest, a big audience, a big fan base? Sure, there's an element of bragging rights mixed in, but there's something deeper going on as well. Genuine affection, even love for the work that we most desire. For me, without a doubt, that's podcasting.
I don't really talk about vegetarianism on the podcast, but occasionally I will say something like that. Well, I'm vegetarian, or we had a vegan pizza. And you wouldn't believe how many people come to me and they say, oh man, I'm vegetarian too. Just like I did with you. Hey, I'm vegetarian. We have something now that's built rapport, and it was an offhanded comment. Just something like, yeah, I'm vegetarian, I'm vegan. That's it. And now we've got this connection. And that's the kind of thing, whether you're doing podcast marketing or you're doing email marketing, or you're doing a sales call, just throw those little things in there. I think so. We're so worried about having this perfect persona, and the perfect persona is imperfect. It is who you are, and it's authentic, not fake, not something that you're doing just for the mic, but it's just who you are. So that's very inspiring. You got me thinking I should talk about trees a little more often.
There you go. So let me ask you a question. So you got this killer book, The Big Podcast. Let me just say this, and I'll just throw this out. Guys, this is a book, and I started having guests on my show. The only guests that I will allow to be on my show from here on out are people who have created work, whether it's in the form of a coaching program, a book, whatever it is, that I feel good enough that I can guarantee or stand behind their work. And this is a book that is, number one, it is worth, if you have any inkling at all to do a podcast, this is the book that you want to invest in. And this is not a book that you just read. This is a manual. This is one of those reference materials that you go back to time and time again. To be frank, there aren't very many good podcast books. I've interviewed some of the top authors who write about podcasting. But this is a book that really stands alone because it covers so many areas that are relevant to a person who's considering a podcast, taking them all the way through to the point of, how to build it, everything that's involved, even the marketing aspect of it. I know you take that further in your coaching program and the things you do on your website, and we'll get to that in just a bit. But I'm going to guarantee the book, guys. So you're going to buy David's book. You're going to use what's in it. If in fact you're going to be a podcaster, which I strongly want to encourage you to do. It does take a lot of work, but I tell you what, I loved being a chiropractor for 17 years. I thrived at it. I made a ton of money, but more importantly, I loved it. I loved the people. And I honestly am at the point now in doing this that I think I love being a podcaster more. And I never thought I would find anything after I retired, and I retired because of my accident. I just couldn't continue to work. I never thought I would find anything I loved as much as being a chiropractor. I think I love being a podcaster more just because of the cool people I get to meet every day. But this is a book. You're going to buy it. You're going to use it. It's going to benefit you multiples, not of the money you spend, but of the time you invest in it. Because David, I got to tell you, it's underpriced. The book is not priced. It's worth multiples. I mean, you couldn't, if you had to pay somebody to teach you all this stuff, you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars to have somebody help you with this. And so, first of all, kudos for putting in all the work to create a book that's this good. I mean, it's just that good that I'm willing to stand behind it. But guys, use it. You're going to be thrilled with it. And if for any reason you can't say that, email me at customerservice@kennewhouse.com and I will buy the book from you. Also, in addition to that, I don't want my brain to run down another rabbit hole, but you also have, I know of at least one podcast. I think you have more than one, but you have the Red Podcast, which is it's a marketing podcast for experts.
Correct. Yes.
Do you have another podcast, or was I just hallucinating there for a minute?
I have a podcast called Build a Big Podcast, which is for experts, but specifically about podcasting. On Red, what I'm telling you how to do is expand your audience in various ways. We talk a lot about podcasting, but it could be book publishing, public speaking, different mediums. And I wanted to do something just for podcasters. It was actually a fluke. I thought I was going to do it. I did it as part of a 30-day challenge. I needed something to podcast about for 30 days. And here I am 3 years later, still at it.
So my question then is this, and I'm going to have to dig into that podcast because I've been listening to Red. And I mean, obviously, you are a pioneer in the field. You're a leader. You've got one of the top ranked shows in the niche, which is very difficult to achieve. So my question is, you got this best-selling book, this killer book. You got more than one awesome podcast. And I'm going to have to assume that your podcast on podcasting is also a top-ranked show like the Red Podcast. But how did all this start? How did you get here?
You talked about missing chiropractic. You thought you would. And as I mentioned at the very top of this episode, I was a musician. I was a musician first before I was in the music industry. And people ask me, do I miss music? And I don't. The reason I got into music was because I was a 15-year-old kid. Let me take that back. The reason I got into music seriously was because I was a 15-year-old kid. I played since I was a 5-year-old. That's when I did my first session. But I wanted somebody as a 15-year-old kid to listen to me. I wanted a voice. And music was the way that I could do that. It's like, if I get a guitar, I see how it works. He's like, you're a normal guy, and you get a guitar, then girls like you. So that's what I'm going to do. And that's what I did. But it really was about having that voice, having people pay attention to me, just know that I existed. Not an egomaniac, have people pay attention to me. Not like that, but just to feel like I had some kind of empowerment. And that's what podcasting does for me. So that really is more or less why I've stuck it out. I kind of got into it as a fluke, as I mentioned, because I was doing radio and I wanted a way to market my business. But then I found out it was so much more than that.
Yeah, it's just amazing. So, you like I said, you've got 2 successful podcasts that I know of. I mean, unless you've got a third one that you're scheming on and you haven't told me about yet. But
we got the radio show. The radio show goes out every week, and that's been on the air for 15 years at this point.
So a real radio show, or is that okay. So what's up with that?
That show is called Music Business Radio. And that is the broadcast show that got me into podcasting. That's when I was on top of the tower.
Okay.
And when I said, hey, we could expand on this. And WRLT in Nashville tuned in broadcasting. And there was a time when it was syndicated all over the place. And now I think we're still on a couple stations. But we've really focused, speaking of podcasting, on podcasting because it's an easier way for us to get the episodes out there. And we can just go directly without working with affiliates or anything like that.
So if I come online, can I crash your radio show and be one of those people that call in, or do you not take call-ins?
That's a great, that's so funny because it comes on a couple times a week. It comes on Sunday and Monday, and I hear the next day, people are like, oh man, you were great last night. You were great. And I was like, who was I talking to? Because we actually tape it well in advance.
Yeah.
And we'll be in the studio for about 2 hours and then cut it down to 45 or 54 minutes, pardon me, because heavily edited. A lot of people, strangely enough, they get nervous when they come in to see me. They're not used to being on the radio once that red light kicks on, even though they're musicians or people who are used to being on a stage. It's a different thing, but it requires editing sometimes to make them sound great.
You have to. So let me ask you this.
Make me sound great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
you
the
and
cool
I. We're keeping this one raw today, so you can see the raw David Hooper. That's
the cool thing about technology. So, David, have you always been successful? Have you always had this level of success in the things that you do? Because you're very successful right now.
It's been funny as we've gone through this episode to hear you say that. I don't know what success feels like. I'm living in a nice house. I get to do what I want to do. I've got a great wife. I've got a dog. I've got all this vegan food around me.
Vegan food is not inexpensive. It is actually
no. Well, I was thinking that
it's an investment to eat well, man. You got to pay for it.
You sure do. Yeah, I was like, we could just get the normal junky food for a third of the price. So, I've got that going for me, and I think there's just something, I guess, growing up in Nashville and being around these musicians. You see people who they get to do what they want to do. And I remember a guy said to me as one of my college professors, he said, I just wanted to wake up and say, I can't believe people pay me to do this. And I've always thought about that. And I think that I can do that. And Have there been lean times? Yes. Have there been amazing times? Yes. Have there been scary times? Absolutely. When this whole coronavirus COVID-19 thing came around, I mean, a lot of the guys that were out doing live events, whether music or speaking or anything like that, and we had stuff that just died. My wife is a photographer, can't get together with models, hairstylists, and those kind of people. Can't do a photo shoot, so what is she going to do? So there's still scary times. I mean, as far as to take it to your thoughts on success and being successful, I will say this. What I have always had is a mouth that I speak my truth. And sometimes that gets me in trouble, but I think that in some ways it's a real gift because, it hasn't let me be in positions that are uncomfortable for me. I've got a very low tolerance for like a 9-to-5 job. I've had dozens of jobs before I figured this thing out.
The term podcasting was coined in 2004 by journalist Ben Hammersley in a newspaper article for The Guardian. He was writing about the potential for a boom in amateur radio, arguing that the ingredients were all there. Blogging was very popular, production software cheap, and MP3 players were all the rage. But what to call it? Audio blogging? Podcasting? Guerrilla media? We all know which one stuck.
And some of them as little as 2 hours.
We sound like we're a lot alike because I tell people frequently that I am perpetually unemployable. That's why I have to be an entrepreneur, because I just can't work for other people who, it's not that I'm super smart or anything, but just I'm a guy with common sense. And when people are directing me to do things that just don't have any common sense, they're not founded in common sense, I have a hard time doing them. And so I'm not a good employee. I'm not cut from that mold. I don't understand the whole, if I had to go get a job right now to save my life and to support my family, which thankfully I don't know that I would be able to do that because I don't even know really where to begin. I don't know.
Does that scare you?
Not at all.
See, it scares me to death. I'm the same way. And I remember I was working a sales job one time, straight out of college. And I had this job not long, but I'd see these guys and they're bringing in their lunch in the paper bags and they just seemed so content. And I wasn't content. And I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it on my own. And it was really scary for me. And it's the blessing, right? I've got this big mouth. It's going to get me in trouble and I'm going to get fired eventually, like sooner than later, probably. But at the same time, I don't have a plan B. And it's what got me here, but it's also, sometimes I don't know, maybe I would have gone for the plan B if I was able to, but I sometimes wonder if I just got lucky. I'm 47 years old. It's like, can I keep this up? I don't know. Because it can go away at any time. I've seen
Youngster. I'm 54. I'll be 55. Man.
Yeah. Well, but you know how it is, though. It's like, can you keep it up? And I have to remind myself constantly, the internal dialogue is that, well, you've gotten this far. Well, you're in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. I wouldn't say it's fear, but it's like some people, they wake up at 5 a.m. and they go to bed at midnight and they work, even though they've got millions of dollars in the bank. It's not something like that. And I certainly don't have millions of dollars in the bank, but there is an element of how long can I keep this up? Because I guess I've seen people sabotage it and mess it up and I don't take it for granted.
Yeah, I don't take it for granted either. And I just want to say one thing before I dig into your book here, because I want people to know more about the book. It's really that good. But I will say this. I'm a born-again Christian. I don't preach on my show. I certainly try to share my faith from time to time. But there were many, many years where I literally was making millions of dollars in my practices. I owned 6 clinics. And then along came someone who told me about Jesus Christ, and I developed a personal relationship with him. And I don't make as much money now, but I consider myself to be wealthier now because money is never an issue for me. It's not a problem. But having said that, I have everything that I could ever want. And the Lord has provided me with just a fabulous wife, a great family. I get to do what I love to do. And I have contentment in my life. And I think for right now, for people who are going through just horrific times, the other guy that I confused you with earlier in the show, because his name's David as well, and he's a podcaster and he's written a book. said, hey, listen, if there's one thing you could do better, because I like to ask my guests at the end of the show and I edit it off, what's the one thing I could do better to make my show better for my guests? And he said, maybe not talk about your accident where I was hit by the truck on all of your episodes. And I said, you know what? You're probably right. I'll start doing that. But having said that, it has made just a tremendous difference in my life. But that accident caused me to go bankrupt. I lost everything. I was hit head on by a dump truck, lost everything I had. So I understand when people are stressed about money. I've been there myself. It's terrifying. I mean, especially if you're that person who's responsible for providing for children or your other family members or whatever, it's a lot of pressure on you. But I have to say that, we still have challenges and stuff that come up in life. I have older parents, but my faith has really helped me a lot. And again, not to preach to anybody at all. I'm just sharing with you what's really working for me, and it's transformed my life. And I'm just so thankful for that. But what's your earliest memory of podcasting, David? I know you've accomplished more than 99.99% of the people with respect to podcasting. But what's your earliest memory of podcasting? The first time you're like, what is that? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, the actual word podcast was through Dave Jackson. Like, oh, I got this thing. It's called a podcast. And I was used to having audio online because that's what we did in the music industry. I mean, I've been involved with hundreds of projects that we put online, but it's been music. I guess other than Dave Jackson and me getting in the radio studio myself to record these radio shows that will later become podcasts, it kind of snuck up on me. I mean, I was inside the music industry. We saw the internal creep of online audio, and it was scary for some. I found it to be exciting.
So let me ask you got this awesome book. It's one of the leading top-selling books on podcasting, big podcast, grow your podcast audience, build listener loyalty, and get everybody talking about your show. Like I said, this is a manual. So if you're thinking about writing a podcast, this is one of those books you got to have. A lot of work went into this. My question is, why'd you write it?
It's very similar to why I started podcasting, actually. I had something to say, and I felt that a book was a great way to say it. Part of that was because after 20-something years in the music industry, I developed a reputation for music marketing. I had a company called musicmarketing.com. I had the second largest music business conference in the country that I owned and ran. So I knew that when I was going to transition out of the music industry, because I was just bored, midlife crisis, that kind of thing. I knew that I needed to make a statement. I felt that a book was the best way to do that, which is ironic because it's a book about podcasting. But for whatever reason, here in this country, we really respect people with books. And you think about big television shows. I mean, who do you see? You see somebody who's topical in the news. You might see a politician. You might see an actor, actress, but you see book authors. And I knew that you mentioned how large it is. It's 462 pages. It makes a statement when somebody sees it. And I was going to need that statement to really start fresh and make a name for myself in podcasting.
If you want to give yourself the best chance at having a top-ranked, successful podcast, this is a book you absolutely have to start with. So let me ask you this. What did you like least about writing the book? Which part of that process did you enjoy the least?
Well, let's talk about the process. It took 4 years to write. The audiobook took another year because I was kind of working out some of the kinks in the first draft, before I put it to audio. And I'm also scared of it, just like a lot of people probably would be when you say 462 pages and they look at it, they get scared. And I knew I was going to have to read it. I'd already written it 3 times. I didn't want to read it again. It's just a long process. And I think it forces you to get clear on your ideas and your beliefs. And you have to run them up the flagpole and see if somebody salutes it before you put it in the book, if it's a good book, which I think that this is. It really forced me to sit down and ask myself, do you want this? Do you want this? Do you want this every day? Because it wasn't easy for me to write it. I'm more of a big idea guy. I used to think I was a business guy until I started working with business guys. So it wasn't an easy process for somebody like me. I feel like I've probably got ADD, can't really focus, and to put together that big of a project is very difficult.
So let me ask you this, Dave, because the average podcast lasts a whopping 8 shows.
Yeah.
That's the average.
Yep.
You've got a bazillion episodes between your shows. I've got like 375 recorded, 359 published. Why do so many podcasters fail, in your opinion?
I think it's because people like you and me, we make it look easy. People hear the finished product, just like you see the finished book. Oh, that's easy.
One of my favorite things about podcasting is the live interaction with my guests. As opposed to blogging, which to me isn't as live and spontaneous, a podcast interview can change direction in an instant. There have been many instances where in the middle of an interview, I veered from my list of prepared questions. Situations where something my guest said pulled me into a topic that hadn't previously crossed my mind. That's one of the things I love about podcasting most. I can start an interview with the expectation of a specific outcome, and I can come out the other side with something much more meaningful than what I imagined possible.
And somebody, for example, will read that book, maybe over a week, maybe 2 weeks. Hey, when's the next one coming out? They don't think about the time that went into making it. Same with your podcast. They hear us for an hour, but they don't think about the time it took for you to research. You and I did a pre-interview, you're editing, you're putting it up. It takes hours and hours to put up an episode. And if you don't know that, you go into it thinking that it's easy. It's not. It's hard to schedule guests. People have technical issues all the time, as you know. And, it's inside is different than the outside. Let's just say that. And you find that in various things of your life. A lot of people get married, then they don't want to be married. Or they start a job, then they don't want to do a job. I think it's just one of those things that it's not for everybody. But unfortunately or fortunately, I think that a lot of people are out selling it like it's easy and everybody should have a podcast. But there is an element of commitment. You really have to want to spread a message and really enjoy it on some level, I think, to be successful with it.
So what about podcasting actually surprises you most?
I'm just so thankful to have an opportunity to be in my house. I'm in a closet right now. Now I've tricked it out. It looks like a studio. Got it wired. I've got all these equipment, blinky lights and things like that. But just to be able to do that and reach so many people, and I'm reaching a small number of people. You've really talked me up, and I appreciate that. But when I think about some of the big podcasts right now, really big podcasts, Joe Rogan, for example, that you could do something like that just in your house and reach so many people. Mark Maron is a great example of that. Was in a garage for so many years. He made enough noise that President Obama said, hey, let's get on that podcast. I mean, how crazy is that? We never would have imagined that 10 or 20 years ago, that somebody out of their house could have that kind of impact. But I think that's the impact that you can have. I think if we look at it beyond that, though, let's not talk about the people, the number of people that you're reaching. Let's think about the one-on-one impact that you can have. In the audiobook version of this, I tell the story of cancer survivors connecting with other cancer survivors and finding out that things can be okay. This isn't the end of your world just because you've got that diagnosis. I talk about a woman, her husband has Alzheimer's, and she didn't know what she was going to do, but she's able to still reach people via a podcast. And I think that's what's blowing my mind, like the ways people are using it to connect and the ways they are connecting. It's not in the big ways that I would have thought of at first.
I mean, you got a top-ranked podcast. I'm not, again, sure about how your podcast about podcasts is doing. I have to assume that it's doing really well. But what would you say is the most difficult aspect of, number one, creating and building a top-ranked podcast? But once you've built that podcast, a show that's doing really, really well, and guys, again, you need to check out the Red Podcast. It is a phenomenal podcast. A lot of your short, I will say this, some of your shows are a lot like shorter than mine. But I love listening to you. I mean, you're a stand-up guy. You're authentic. Your content's awesome. It rocks. And you got 442 5-star reviews, which is killer, man. That's just incredible. So I'm nowhere close to that. I just started asking, 2 months ago for people to give me reviews. That lasted about a week, and then I forgot to do it. So as many downloads as I get, I'm shocked that I don't have more reviews.
Well,
but I guess
reviews aren't as much of a thing now as they used to be, because we're getting podcasts in so many different ways. When it was just iTunes, that was where people were leaving the reviews. And nowadays, we've got Spotify and we've got, who knows?
TuneIn, you got iHeartRadio.
Yeah,
you got
millions of places to get a podcast. And it is nice to have reviews, but at the same time, it's not something I put a lot of stock in. With that said, if you end up buying this book, please leave a review. I could use some more on the book. So it's not that easy. So I'm with you right there trying to get more reviews.
What's your biggest podcasting failure been, Dave?
Oh, man, that's a good question. And I always hate when people say, oh, that's a good question. But that really is. I'm not lying to you on that. I don't think of failure. I mean, I look at it as a lesson learned. And I've certainly made a lot of mistakes in podcasting. When we started Red, I started it with my wife. It wasn't the podcast that it is now. And this was after 10 years in broadcasting. Mm-hmm. I was like, we don't need to edit. Let's just do it live. Let's just keep it light. And about 2 weeks into that, I realized that yeah, we need to edit. This is not that good. So that's either a failure or a lesson. But it's not that I'm not making mistakes. I just don't think of them as any failure. So I don't know how to answer that. I think that if I had to do it again, as far as I'm looking at all the equipment and the flashy, blinky stuff, one of the things that I tried to do at the beginning of Red, I was like, I'm going to own podcasting. And I got some cheaper mics. And I got some stuff that I still use, but I got some cheaper interfaces. And I was like, we're going to own it. This isn't radio. Even the name Red Podcast, we were proud of it. And I think probably what I would have done I would have invested in some better microphones, but I didn't know if I was going to keep it up. So, and so I ended up having to upgrade, and I've got the old studio mics and now the portable mics. And it's fine, but I do think it's important to put intention and put something into your podcast if you know that it's something that you want to do. But again, I don't know, so I don't beat myself up and say it was a mistake. But if I had to do it all over again, for me, that's what I would do.
You can find, book, and interview amazing guests by doing your research and working harder than the competition. Do whatever it takes. A little boot leather, a little elbow grease, some get up and go, maybe even call in a few favors to help you access those seemingly impossible people you'd love to interview. These things all go a long way when you're committed to getting that prize guest and interview of your dreams. What do you think the 3 most important elements are when you're interviewing a guest to really get the best out of that interview?
Another great question. And let me give you a couple of them off the bat. You want to have the right guest, because not all guests are equal. Sometimes I'll see people on Facebook and be, oh my God, I need a guest. Anybody available in the next 5 minutes to be my guest? It's like, no, don't do that. So the first thing is going to be just like a wife, just like a husband, spouse. You want to research somebody. You don't want to get connected with the wrong person. So research your guest, listen to other interviews, find out, are they somebody that you're maybe not necessarily in agreement with always, but at least are going to provide something valuable for your people. I think that you need to do a pre-interview, which you did. You're one of the few people who do it. Now that I'm doing more podcasts about the book, I can't believe that. So if you can do a pre-interview to build rapport with people, get connected with them beforehand so they know what's up. You're great at letting me know what you want to use as far as software, and just keeping me informed lets me prepare more for you. And then the third one is, I think, just realizing you're on the same team, that I'm not out here a good guest. And I'll say not just me, but if you've got a good guest, if you've done your research, they're not just out there wanting to hear themselves talk. What they're doing is hopefully working with you. They should be working with you to give you a great episode as a host that is going to help your audience. So I think having that element, making sure that you're on the same page with them, it's going to get you a better interview, not just being like me. It's all about me, buy my stuff. You certainly see people like that. So if you do have somebody like that, I would suggest that you can be nice, you can finish it up, but don't release the interview. You don't have to release every interview that you do.
Yeah, I have probably 5 or 6 of those that I don't think I will ever release. I mean, I had one guy, I'm like, hey, listen, we're talking about persuasion today, and just because you learn these principles or these methods and you develop a power to sell stuff to people much more easily, doesn't mean it's right to sell someone to someone just because you can. If it's not the right situation, I mean, be ethical about it. And he took me to task on my show, and I'm like, what? So I didn't air the podcast, and it's unfortunate. I guess I could And at some point, I probably will air the show. I'll just have that edited out. But I was taken back. I'm like, dude, I brought you on my show. I'm promoting your book. And you want to take me to task because I used the word ethical and said, we shouldn't do this stuff. So he was, I don't know. It is what it is. But you got the Red podcast. You're doing fabulously well with it. Like, what's that about? How did you do that?
I think that you need to bring something to the table that nobody else can. So when I mentioned doing the book, making the transition from the music industry, one of the things I thought I was going to do, I wasn't going to be ashamed of my background in the music industry, but I didn't want to be known as the music industry guy. So I wasn't going to mention it. I was like, I'm just going to get into podcasting and talk about media marketing because I've done other work. I've worked with television, radio, other performers, comics, those kind of things. And I got into writing this book. I was like, wait a minute, I've got so many great stories that will help podcasters from my time in the music industry and so many great experiences and so many connections of people that I can go to that would make interesting guests that experts will benefit from their info. I think you need to embrace who you are. And I think having that differentiation that embraces who you are and expands upon that makes it bigger, bolder, louder, rather than trying to be somebody else. Like if I got on the recorder in the studio and tried to be Mark Maron or tried to be Joe Rogan or tried to be some of these huge podcasts, Terry Gross, This American Life, that's not me. My podcast is a little bit edgy, not too edgy. It's not like Call Her Daddy, but it's edgier than maybe a Michael Hyatt podcast, if you're familiar with some of these bigger podcasts. He plays it pretty safe. I don't play it that safe. He couldn't do my podcast. I couldn't do his. And we have, in some ways, two different audiences. And the audience that I guess that we share, I think there's respect. Like, I love it that you said, I'm a born again Christian. I am not personally. And I think if you can come to it like that, you say, this is who I am, but show your humanity and show other people's humanity. That's actually a very good thing because it allows us to hear people of different perspectives, but see the commonalities that we do have. So I think that's the way to differentiate yourself. And people can tell what's real coming through, because otherwise you're going to get caught. You're going to get caught.
A buddy of mine in Texas always says that there are things that are fun while you're doing them, and there are things that are fun to remember. If I just emailed that coveted podcast guest and invited them onto my show, and within minutes they emailed me back and said, sure thing, I'd love to, and we did the interview like next week, I wouldn't be talking about it in 20 years.
It's funny, I mentioned Call Her Daddy, and they're going through something right now where it's a huge podcast. They're making $100,000 per episode every week. Big numbers. And two women, if you're not familiar with the podcast, they were best friends, they're roommates, they're getting along, they have that unified front, right? But there was a lot of behind the scenes that we didn't see. And now that that's out in the open, people feel like they were tricked. And will the audience stick with them? I don't know. People don't like to be tricked. And I'm not saying you need to, fake it or be 100% real. It's probably somewhere in the middle, because we are, as I mentioned, bigger, bolder, louder when we're on the mic than we are off of it. That's a great host, in my opinion. But it has to have that real element, and people don't like to be tricked, and they want to have something authentic. Otherwise, they listen to radio.
All right. Well, I'm gonna ask you like two more questions, but I want to say this, and don't let this go to your head because you get enough compliments already. But this is a genuine, heartfelt compliment. I have to say, I've interviewed a lot of people, not as many as you probably over the years with radio and stuff, but you are by far the most professional as it relates to your timing and your voice presentation and your just approach to being on air, whether it's a podcast or radio. I can tell immediately the difference between talking to you, David, and talking to the guy I just had on a little earlier today, who's got a huge fan base, a monstrous fan base. He's definitely, he doesn't have your skill. He doesn't have it. It's been fabulous to sit here and just have a dialogue with you because of the fact that you are a consummate professional, dude. You're good. You're really good at what you do. My son went to college. He's going for his PhD now, but he wanted to be a broadcaster. He wanted to be in radio.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get him out of that. Hey, Kenny, you're not always commercial man. You know how the radio commercial guys talk?
Radio voice. Yeah, we call that the puke voice.
Yeah, I'm like, don't be radio man when you're on my podcast, because he's been on my show with me. It's been a while now, but he's been on before. And he's a great guest when he's on. He's a very smart kid, really good kid, but you're good. You're really, really, really good. And I just want to thank you, because I love all my shows, but this is one of the shows where, as I'm talking with you, I'm paying very close attention to you because you're that good. So thank you for the lesson.
Let's talk about that for a second, because I think this is something that gets podcasters. One, it doesn't get them past that 7th or 8th episode that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is I think people are surprised. This is what I talk about being bigger, bolder, and louder. I'm talking to you in a way that's a little bit bigger, bolder, and louder than I would if we were talking and that red light wasn't on, if we were just hanging out. I'm an introvert, man. I'm going to be chilling with you, and I'm not that animated. So you want to be a little bit animated, but you don't want to be like, hey, Ken, hey, glad to be here. Great day in Nashville, Tennessee.
Yes.
Hello to all the listeners out there.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us. You don't want to sound like a strip club DJ. We need something authentic. That's what podcasters want. So I would say go to that puke voice, be like, hey, Ken, glad to be here. And then just tone it down just a little bit. If that's like a 10 for you, maybe, take it to a 7. And you'll find it, because I think that is one of the scary things. If you'll remember this, Ken, because you and I are closer in age. Remember college radio when you would turn on Vanderbilt University used to have a college radio station, and it would be so boring. Okay, here's the next song by The Cure. Here it is. Okay. They weren't even trying. And I think people are either on that end or they're into the puke voice. But yeah, you soon figure that out. That's one of the reasons that I recommend that all podcasters edit themselves. Don't outsource your editing, at least not at first. You'll get very comfortable, or you'll have to get comfortable with who you are and know all the flaws. And I appreciate the compliments, because as I'm talking about this, I'm hearing all the mistakes that I'm making. I'm like, edit that. That needs to be changed. So thank you for the compliments.
It was heartfelt. Yeah, it's a genuine compliment. And anytime that I can learn from somebody else, I love to work with people who are better than me. I love that, because it lets me know that I got a long way to go to improve, to get better, that I can get better. And if they, my mindset is always, hey, if they can do it, I can do it. Usually, I can't dunk a basketball anymore, but you know what I'm saying? Within reason.
Yeah.
I can do it. And so when I hear somebody, just like I talked to Florence Kiley, she wrote Beyond Influencer Marketing. I got to tell you, blew me away. She's much younger than we are. And number one, it's a great book, but I talked to her and just in the pre-interview, and then I listened to her show because she's going to be on in just a couple weeks. I'm like, I thought I was doing a pretty decent job. This kid, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but her podcast, it rocks. Beyond Influencer Marketing. She's talented.
Let's call them kids. These new kids coming up, they're what I call natives. They grew up with podcasting. They grew up with YouTube. They grew up with shooting their own videos, editing it, and they're super comfortable at it. You know, it's funny. I mentioned my wife is a photographer, and these girls come in, and they're girls, because yesterday, 17-year-old, she's 17. She started modeling when she was 15, and they come in, and they're already skilled. They know how to pose. They know what to do. And why is that? Instagram. They're used to taking pictures of themselves, looking at themselves, and they know what looks good. They know what doesn't look good. Us as podcasters, I heard something from Terry Gross, and you'll know her from NPR.
Mm-hmm.
She talked about being on the radio in the early 70s, and she said, this is going to sound crazy, but we had never heard our voices before. We had never recorded our voice. The first time I was on radio, didn't know what my voice sounded like, because it sounds different when it's recorded.
Absolutely.
You and I had a little more experience with that. These kids coming up, not a thing. So we're getting ready to see some major innovation, and they can learn from us what we've brought to the table and how far we've taken things. We can learn from them. And I love that. I see that as inspiration, 100%. Yeah. And if you're the smartest guy in the room, you are in the wrong room.
That's true. Absolutely true. So where are you going to be in 10 years from now? What are you going to be doing?
Oh man, I don't know. I'm still going to be doing something with my voice, provided my voice is still here. Because you never know. Like about a month ago, my tongue swelled up and I was like, oh, I couldn't talk. Some kind of allergic reaction, maybe pineapple. And, you realize, like I said, it can go away at any minute. I hope that I'm here. I hope that I'm better. I'm hoping that I'm smoother. I hope that I've still got something to say, still waking up saying, I can't believe people pay me to do this.
Didn't you do a show where you talked about your tongue blowing up?
I did, because I couldn't record. I had to let people know. This is where the authenticity comes in. Had a lisp and everything.
I didn't listen to the show, but I was going to. I didn't have time. Just briefly, give me the minute version of the show.
Yeah, well, I woke up and my tongue was swollen up, and I noticed it because I had a little bit of peanut butter, and I couldn't get it off the roof of my mouth. I said, wait a minute. I felt like my tongue was fat. And like I said, I started talking with a lisp. Uh-oh. Gave it a few days, called a friend of mine who's a nurse practitioner, ended up having to go to the doctor, get a steroid shot. I'm not sure that helped or just timing helped. I don't know. They don't know what caused it, but, it's...
Could have been that pineapple.
Well, that's what they said. Could it have been nuts? Could it have been the peanut butter? I'd never had issues with that stuff before. Could it have been allergies? One time, related to this, one day I woke up, I couldn't hear anything out of my left ear. That's another thing that would be devastating for a podcaster.
I deal with that right now.
Yeah. Yep. And went in and had, they basically did fracking on my ear. They had to put a bunch of water in there and break a bunch of stuff up and scrape it out, because people who wear headphones, they have to deal with that stuff. So, yeah, I mean, you got to share that stuff. Limbaugh is an interesting radio DJ. He went completely deaf, and they were having to do his show. I think he was getting, Mr. Snerdley was typing the transcript there for him as callers would call in. And then he got a cochlear implant, and now he's back on the air. But, that's what you say, 10 years. I mean, provided everything holds up, you really never know. I'm just going to keep up, try to do it as long as I can. I'm going to try to keep that vegan diet, get outside and exercise, and try to make this happen, because I still have things to say. And I know that there are people that still have something to say as well, and I want to help them tell that story. That's one of the reasons that I started doing interviews on Red, more than just me being a solo monologue podcast, because these guys are so brilliant. I want to bring them in on it.
So what's the one question today that I should have asked that I didn't?
I always ask that. Where'd you get that? That's brilliant. That's brilliant.
I stole that from Larry King.
Did you?
Yes, I did.
Well, I don't know where I stole it from. It wasn't him, but he's a great interviewer. A little softball, but obviously is a guy who's been around and knows what he's doing and can control the situation like crazy. Man, I think you've done a great job. I really appreciate you have brought something different to this than I expected. You and I talked beforehand. I listened to episodes, but you got a podcast called Get Clients Now. And you're talking to me with like a headset, and I'm like, okay, this is a sales guy. I'm making these judgments on you. This guy is like serious about going to get clients. I knew a little bit about your background, and I thought it was going to be more salesy, but you've brought a great level of humanity. And we talked about connection, which is of course part of sales, but you weren't going into the, hey, talk about the process close. Let's talk about the process close. How can we do this? And let's talk about the upsells and the cross sells. And no, it wasn't anything like I thought. And I think you did a great job with it.
Thank you. You mentioned Larry King. I spent probably 2.5 hours yesterday watching interviews on YouTube of him. I want to bring value to people. I really do. I want people to listen to my show and go, man, that's a good show. That guy's got some good guests on there. Man, that's some cool stuff I just learned. I really like that. It makes me happy. It's helping me. I want to do that. I want to be the guy that people are like, yeah, that guy's kind of cool. I appreciate what he's doing. It's good stuff. So, and
think about what it does for your sales process, because people are already pre-sold. They know you. They know who you are. They know what you do. Yep. And it makes getting them on the phone or whatever your sales process is so much easier, because you don't have to win them over. You don't have to convince them of anything. They're already convinced. And I think for anybody who is in sales, that's a great reason to have a podcast.
I sometimes have honest moments where I'm willing to admit that while I've interviewed many amazing guests like David, my desire for that elusive and truly magnificent guest that like nobody gets on their show is likely to go unfulfilled. I'm comfortable not getting that interview so long as I know that there are big interviews out there to go after. But what I'm not okay with is the idea that I can't get a big guest for my podcast because we as podcasters have screwed things up so bad that there are fewer and fewer truly amazing people with amazing stories and powerful ideas who are willing to share what they know on a podcast. As a podcaster, I say we have an obligation to preserve the integrity of podcasting by preserving the innately important things that it needs to stay alive: truth, honor, and integrity.
Even if it's not perfect, there are going to be people that connect to you. Not everybody's going to connect to you, but enough. And that's what I think the focus should be on for podcasters. It's not a bigger audience, it's a better audience. And I know that's the irony of having a book called Big Podcast. My next book may be actually called Small Podcast, since we're talking about our next books. But it's about going for those hyper-focused podcasts. I think that's where the real opportunity is. You were asking about other podcasts that I have. I had one for a couple of years that I didn't mention here, but it was just a neighborhood podcast. You know what I talked about? Planting trees in the neighborhood.
Sweet.
I talked about speed bumps. I talked about really boring stuff unless
You lived
you're
in that
in
neighborhood.
the neighborhood. We had about 1/4 of we're talking about 1,200 houses maybe in my neighborhood, and we might have had 1/3 of them listen to it. That's a lot, though. That's a huge saturation for that neighborhood. So you got
that's tremendous penetration. Absolutely.
It's crazy, right? So little local coffee shop, and they were bringing in business, and they were supporting the neighborhood, and that's how it made money. It was one of the most effective and I guess profitable, if you want to think about it, podcasts that I had. For no episode was over 3 or 4 minutes. It was just a calendar is all it was.
It's just amazing how many different variations of a podcast. You think, when I think of a podcast, I'm thinking of doing an interview or I'm thinking of doing a solo, but there are so many variations of podcasts. There is no limit. It's wide open. You can make it whatever you want it to be. And as long as you got listeners, or if you want to keep doing it and nobody's listening, I mean, I guess some people, that's why they only do HOs. I don't know. It is a lot of work, but I tell you what, it's a lot of fun. So first of all, what's the best way to buy your book?
Well, if you like audiobooks and you were here listening to a podcast, so I'm assuming you like audio, if you go to bigpodcast.net, like catching it in the net, bigpodcast.net/audiobook, there is a free audiobook via Audible that you can get with the trial. It'll take you straight to the book. That's a good way to get it. Amazon has it, or bigpodcast.com is my website. That has information on all the podcasts we've talked about, the book, and other podcasting related things. I've got a blog where I talk about blogging. We've got a podcasting agency where we work with entertainers. We're all in on podcasting now.
So take a minute or so and tell us about the podcasting agency, because that piques my interest.
Yeah, the podcast agency is actually brand new. It has just started within the last couple of months. And one of the things that we are doing, coming from the entertainment space, is that many of the podcasts, much like you, I found that they aren't really doing a good job of telling the stories of people. And they aren't very professionally produced, and they're problematic. So we brought some skills to the table of engineering and storytelling and working with entertainers. With so many musicians off the road right now, so many entertainers off the road, we felt that podcasting was a great way to get them back in the minds of people, speakers, authors. So started an agency just for people in the entertainment industry. And that's called VoxPhonic. You can find out more information at bigpodcast.com.
Sweet.
But it's more or less a very hands-on thing. It's probably not really for an independent podcaster as much as it is for like a larger company. But yeah, you can see some of the stuff that we're doing there.
All right. Well, Dave, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. And again, thank you for being on the show today. I certainly appreciate the investment you've made, not only for myself, but for the members of the Get Clients Now Nation and being on the show. I know you're a busy guy. So again, on behalf of all of us, I just can't offer enough thanks and gratitude for you being on the show, because you've done a fabulous job today. Done a great job. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Ken, thank you so much for this opportunity. It was a blast, and let's do it sooner than later. And when we can all get together in the same space, we're going to have you down here to Nashville and hang out a bit.
Looking forward to it.
Our objective with this podcast is to help you and your business stand out in the marketplace by crystallizing your messaging, marketing, and communications. On behalf of the whole Ken Newhouse team, thanks for listening.